Akira is an anime movie from the 1980s that has quite the reputation. I actually thought I had already seen this. Turns out, no. And now I just watched it twice back to back because I was so blown away by what I just experienced. And its importance for the evolution of the art form is so prevalent even to this day in watching it. I immediately after watching it twice just did a bunch of research about the movie, the production behind it, because I was so fascinated by what I had just watched. So disclaimer, I'm predisposed to really loving this movie. Not only does it take place in dystopian sci-fi future, which I very much so like, but it's also in a very similar vein in terms of tones and its representation of the future to many of my favorite sci-fi movies of all time, like Blade Runner. I love movies that essentially show the problems of today will just get worse and worse and become so much more unavoidable in society's day-to-day life. And Akira is so metaphorical and representative of deeper historical issues within humanity and specifically Japan. I don't want to get too much into spoilers here because I went in knowing nothing. Literally, I just as it started was like, oh, this is going to be a movie about biker gang wars. I was very wrong. But to be as vague as possible, Akira is essentially a movie about government experimentation, the hubris of man, how we make repeated mistakes, national identity, and the storyline follows a few members of a biker gang and their accidental involvement with these government tests. And the government, through this, inadvertently essentially makes something far beyond their control. All right, but let's go ahead and start talking about the individual pieces of this review. And because it's an anime, I just want to address the art style right away. Initially, I didn't love it because there was just some jittery movements and stiffness to the people. But as I just kind of became more acclimated to it, this movie's use of color and just extreme brutality in its literal depiction of violence became so connected with the wider themes and the story that was being told. I ended up really loving the art style. It's not as beautiful as, let's say, a Studio Ghibli film often is, but the art serves a purpose so well, you can't help but end up respecting what this movie accomplishes through the visuals put before you. I don't think this will be up in a lot of people's lists of most beautiful movies of all time. It's actually extremely gory and intentionally ugly, but there is a beauty to that intentional ugliness. And this is going to be a nice transition into the tone. This is a dark movie, probably one of the darkest anime movies I've ever seen, and it kind of just full on leans in and embraces that, because when you're tackling the themes this movie covers, anything else would be a disservice or disrespectful to those themes. This is a perfect example of why art needs to not be limited or restricted from going into body horror or explicitly showing extreme acts of violence. I'm going to die on this hill and debate someone any day about it. Being able to actually depict violence in art is extremely important to honestly and truthfully tell stories. For movies like this, or even movies that depict real events from history, if you hold back, if you don't actually show how horrible things can be, in my opinion, that's disrespectful to how bad things have been. Something I would point to is like in Saving Private Ryan, the invasion of Normandy. If you hold back in your depiction of just how horrible that day was, it's disrespectful to the people who actually went there and served. So, similar vein here, where if you're going into the themes of government corruption, abuse of power, cultist behavior, and the awful that can come about because of that, you need to show it accurately and fully, if the narrative you're painting requires it. I'm not saying you have to put it into every instance of like this. I'm saying if the narrative asks for it, you would be doing a disservice not to include it. I'm not saying shoehorn that violence in out of some necessity. Does that make sense? And this movie just walks that line very, very well. Okay, I've mentioned themes a few times now. What exactly is this movie trying to say? Well, after looking online quite a bit about Japan's own history after World War II. In fact, this movie takes place in a similar time jump after World War III, and there's a lot about the turmoil that Japan faced as a country, just amplified in the ways that it could be here. And even with this government experiment character and the transformations he goes through, there's a lot you can draw into about Japan's fears of losing its identity and the industrial age it dove extraordinarily rapidly into, and how fears became very abundant through that about losing culture or somehow being pulled away from your own soul in a sense once you become so immersed in another nation's technology or technological advancement, capitalism, the fears around that. And then you have some, wow, it's aged extremely well in terms of comparisons to what's going on in the real world. There's protests going on in this movie against government corruption, and then there's like bad actors within the protests and people within the government that are bad actors. It's kind of, I was looking at this movie trying to say like, okay, who is it saying is the good guys? But in reality, to me, in my reading of it, Akira was kind of just pointing out how there's going to be exploiters everywhere. There's people who are always looking to work for themselves or find answers in cheap, quick ways, which will then undermine larger ideas or actual movements towards progression. And you can really take a lot away from this movie. And I'm coming off pretty fresh from it and need to think on it more before I really say, like, this is what I was trying to say. Here's what I took away from it. So if you have a different reading, you've watched it longer ago, you've thought about it more. It's probably more accurate than myself. I loved what this movie did. I don't agree with everything I think it's trying to say at all points, but I can appreciate a piece of art that makes its statement as all out as Akira obviously did. And I'm really surprised to see such a graphic, brutal movie come out of Japan in the 80s like this. I was under the impression that this would not have been made, quite frankly, but obviously it was, and it became such a influential piece for, I would go as far as to say all of cinema since. I'd say there's clear American movies that came out after this that now, after watching Akira, I pulled from it. Oh, I enjoyed seeing so many reflections in my favorite sci-fi movies, and I need to go double check some dates to see which is pulling from which here, but this belongs in the conversations with some of the most nuanced and interesting sci-fi movies of all time, because for me, sci-fi as a genre exists to say something, to make observations, to explore ideas, and Akira undoubtedly did that. It's not going to be for everybody because it's hard to stomach. There's a few scenes in this movie that are seared into my brain because of how brutal and grotesque they are. One including stuffed animals in an assassination attempt that was just and an arm that is nightmare fuel. Okay, a few more technical pieces of praise. The sound design in this movie is absolutely spectacular, and in addition to that, I watched it once with the original Japanese and then again with the English dubbing, and I'm happy to say both were fantastic. The English dubbing really was well done. So if you can find an English dub version, go ham. I already ordered a poster for this movie and a t-shirt because it's wonderful. And the soundtrack, oh my God, this is probably in my top 3 anime movie soundtracks of any I've heard. It just hit raw, not only on its own, like you could just listen to the soundtrack, but serving scene after scene to just explicitly enhance the emotion without ever crossing that line into campiness. Spectacular. Truly spectacular. For me, Akira is going to be a solid 9.5 out of 10 for a movie. Loved it. The characters were just so punchy and well realized and personality filled. The plot was so meticulously thought through. The tone was just consistent without ever getting tiring. Across the board, high recommendation, especially for anyone who considers themselves a cinephile who really wants to see the greats of each medium and genre. this is going to be in my must-watch for animes from here on out. Whether you agree with its messaging or not, it's important to watch movies that come from a perspective you're not familiar with. And I feel like Akira is going to be, especially for Americans, saying something from an angle many of us have probably never thought about culturally. But anyway, let me know what you think of this classic in the comments down below. Do you like it? Do you hate it? Do you think my read of it is completely off base? Or are you quite the fan? Let me know, and I'm very much so looking forward to the conversation this video sparks. And like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. And have a good one, y'all. Peace! And of course, I'd like to record a special shout out to my latest high tier Patreon, Anthony D. Great.